Please, Miller, I'm begging you. Don't take it. I need that to survive.
You should have thought of that before you crossed me. Get up!
$850, Sarah. Or you and that dying mother of yours are sleeping on the asphalt tonight. When the overweight, former police chief turned landlord snatched the $400 bottle of insulin from the weeping woman's hands, he made the fatal mistake of his life. He didn't notice the vagrant in the foul-smelling coat sitting quietly in the dimly lit hallway. And he certainly didn't realize that the crumpled check the homeless man was pulling from his pocket wasn't for the $850 past due rent. That check was meant to buy the entire building, along with the landlord's entire career. Hello friends, welcome back to our channel. Before we dive deep into today's intense story of justice and revenge, please take a second to like this video, share, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. Now, let us return to the suffocating tension. Inside apartment 4B, the air in the cramped room was thick, smelling heavily of cheap industrial bleach and stale frying oil clinging to Sarah's faded uniform. She was 28 years old, physically shattered from working consecutive double shifts at the local discount superstore. She knelt on the scuffed, splintering hardwood floor, her breathing shallow and frantic. On the cracked screen of her cheap prepaid smartphone, the banking application displayed a freezing, absolute reality: $12, $45. She was exactly 3 days late on rent. Towering over her was Miller. Weighing 280 pounds, the ex-police chief dominated the small space. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders, and a heavy, 18-karat gold Rolex gleamed maliciously on his thick wrist. He took a long, slow drag from an imported cigar, exhaling the thick smoke directly into Sarah's pale face. "The law is the law, sweetheart," Miller rumbled, his voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy. $850 right now. If not, I am locking the doors and the two of you are out on the curb. From the rusted metal cot in the corner of the room, Sarah's elderly mother let out a frail, rattling cough. The sound was incredibly weak, a grim reminder of the ticking clock on her life. "Because you clearly lack the funds," Miller sneered, his eyes locking onto the small bedside table, "I will be taking this as collateral." He stepped forward, his heavy, polished leather boots thudding against the floorboards. He violently kicked a wooden chair out of his path, the clatter echoing in the small room, before reaching out and snatching the tiny, clear vial of insulin from the table. It was her mother's lifeline. It was the exact vial Sarah had secured by selling her last possession of value, a silver necklace left by her late father. "Please, Mr. Miller. She won't survive the weekend without that medication." Sarah screamed, her voice cracking as her fingers desperately gripped the perfectly pressed fabric of his trousers. "My credit score is 510. No bank will look at me. I just need exactly 48 hours until my payroll clears." "Not my problem," Miller grunted. He forcefully kicked his leg, sending Sarah sprawling backward onto the unforgiving floor. A cruel, satisfied smile crept across his face. He thrived on this. He was a man who measured his own worth by the absolute power he held over the helpless. But Miller was completely blind to the silent observer. Sitting just outside the open doorway, shrouded in the shadows of the flickering hallway bulb, was Arthur. To the casual observer, Arthur was just another tragic casualty of the city. A homeless man draped in a ragged, damp wool coat, sporting an unkempt silver beard and a weathered face. Just 3 days prior, Sarah had quietly handed him half of a turkey sandwich and her only spare woolen blanket when she found him shivering in the building's alleyway. She had no idea that beneath the dirt and the ragged layers was Arthur Sterling. He was the chairman of Sterling Biomedical, a pharmaceutical empire controlling the eastern seaboard. His verified net worth was $8.2 billion. Arthur did not dress in rags because he enjoyed the aesthetic of poverty. He did not do it for a bizarre social experiment. He did not do it for charity tax write-offs. He did it because it was the only way he could breathe. 15 years ago, before the massive corporate mergers, before the private jets, and before his bank accounts held 9 zeros, Arthur was just a desperate man in a waiting room. His wife had contracted a rare respiratory illness. The insurance company denied the claim. The hospital demanded a $150,000 deposit. Arthur couldn't pay it. By the time he secured a predatory loan, it was too late. She passed away in a sterile, indifferent ward. Now he possessed the capital to buy every hospital in the state in cash. He lived in a sprawling $40 million estate that felt nothing like a home. It was a massive, silent tomb. The guilt of surviving her, of acquiring unimaginable wealth only after she was gone, was a permanent, agonizing void in his chest. A void that no amount of luxury could ever fill. He wandered the poorest districts in disguise to find the people slipping through the cracks of the very system that broke him. Watching Miller snatch the life-saving medication from a desperate caregiver triggered a visceral, terrifying shift in Arthur's eyes. The memory of his late wife gasping for air crashed into him like a freight train. Every word Miller spoke was sealing his own financial coffin. Arthur slowly rose from the cold concrete floor. He did not reach into his pocket for spare change. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached inside his tattered coat and pulled out a matte black, titanium-encased satellite phone. It was directly linked to a team of the most aggressive, relentless corporate fixers in Manhattan. Not a single physical blow needed to be struck today. The vengeance coming from Miller would be surgical, devastating, and absolute. In exactly 48 hours, the arrogant ex-police chief would lose his properties, his luxury cars, and his pristine credit rating. He would be completely liquidated. The very moment Miller laughed at Sarah's despair was the exact moment his entire empire began to burn to the ground. Arthur's thumb hovered over the encrypted dial pad. The game had just begun. The titanium phone glowed faintly in Arthur's calloused palm, but before his thumb could press the single digit that would initiate Miller's financial execution, the suffocating stillness of the room exploded into frantic motion. Sarah could not wait for a miracle. The rattling, labored breathing of her elderly mother echoing from the rusted cot severed the last threads of her restraint. Driven by a primal, blinding desperation, she scrambled up from the hardwood floor and launched herself directly at the 280-pound landlord. The movement was a blur of pure, uncalculated kinetic energy. Sarah slammed into Miller's side, her hands desperately clawing at his thick wrist, her fingernails scraping against the heavy gold Rolex. She managed to catch hold of his forearm, her entire body weight pulling downward in a frantic attempt to pry the tiny glass vial of insulin from his meaty fingers. "Give it back!" she shrieked, her voice tearing through the quiet building. Miller's face contorted into a mask of absolute, ugly fury. He was a man accustomed to blind obedience, deeply insulted that a fragile, exhausted retail worker would dare lay a hand on his custom-tailored suit. With a guttural snarl, he planted his heavy leather boots, bracing his massive frame. He didn't just push her. He violently swept his arm backward, using his overwhelming size to throw her off. The sheer force of the motion sent Sarah flying across the narrow gap of the room. She crashed violently against the far wall, her shoulder slamming into the peeling, faded floral wallpaper with a sickening, hollow thud. The impact knocked the wind completely out of her lungs. She slid down to the floor, gasping for air, momentarily paralyzed by the shock and the sharp, radiating pain in her collarbone. "You crazy, hysterical wretch!" Miller roared, his face flushed an angry crimson. He raised his heavy boot, taking a menacing step toward where she lay crumpled. He was fully prepared to teach her a permanent lesson in respect. He never saw the shadow move. The momentum in the cramped room shifted in a single, fluid, breathtaking sequence. From the dimly lit threshold of the apartment, the ragged, silent vagrant stepped seamlessly into the frame. Arthur moved with a frightening, calibrated precision that entirely defied the frail, elderly persona he wore. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. In his right hand, Arthur held a heavy, solid oak walking cane, its surface scarred and weathered from the streets. He did not swing it wildly. Instead, with the practiced, martial efficiency of a man who had paid millions to learn how to defend himself, Arthur drove the thick wooden shaft upward in a brutal, lightning-fast arc. The heavy wood struck dead center on the radial nerve of Miller's forearm. There was no broken skin, no gore, just the sharp, deafening crack of dense wood meeting bone and the immediate, overwhelming shock of kinetic trauma. Miller's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as his hand instantly went numb, his fingers involuntarily springing open. The vial of insulin slipped from his grasp, dropping toward the unforgiving floor. But before the fragile glass could shatter, Arthur's left hand shot out, catching the vial mere inches from the ground with the reflexes of a predator. Miller stumbled backward, clutching his paralyzed right arm against his chest. The pain was blinding, a sharp electrical fire shooting up to his shoulder. He stared at the homeless man in the filthy, damp wool coat, completely bewildered. This beggar, this piece of street trash, had just disarmed him without breaking a sweat. Arthur slowly straightened his posture. The slouch was gone. The trembling was gone. When he looked at Miller, the cold, dead, absolute authority in his eyes made the massive ex-police chief instinctively take another step back. "You," Miller stammered, his bravado momentarily fracturing under the sheer intensity of the vagrant's stare. He looked at Sarah, then back at Arthur, his humiliation quickly mutating back into arrogant rage. "You are going to rot in a county jail cell for that, old man. I know every judge in this district. I'll have you locked up for assault, and I'll have her thrown into the street by force." Miller cradled his throbbing arm, backing out into the hallway. He stopped at the threshold, his face twisted in a venomous sneer. 2 hours. Miller spat, his voice echoing down the corridor. "You have exactly 2 hours to pack whatever garbage you can carry. When I come back, I'm bringing the precinct deputies. If you aren't gone, you're both leaving in handcuffs." The heavy, aggressive thud of Miller's leather boots retreated down the stairs, fading into the ambient noise of the city. Inside the apartment, the silence that followed was heavy and crushing. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, sobbing silently into her hands. The reality of the 2-hour deadline was an impossible weight. How could she move her dying mother? Where would they go? The shelter system was overflowing, and the night air was dropping toward freezing. Arthur walked over to the cot, gently placing the vial of insulin on the bedside table. He did not say a word to Sarah. He knew that any hollow words of comfort right now would be an insult to her pain. He needed to provide a solution, not sympathy. Pulling the collar of his tattered coat up around his neck, Arthur stepped back out into the flickering shadows of the hallway. He leaned against the cold brick wall, finally raising the matte black satellite phone to his ear. He pressed the single button. The line rang exactly once before being picked up in a high-rise office tower 300 miles away. "Elias," Arthur spoke, his voice dropping an octave, resonant with raw, unchecked corporate power. "Mr. Sterling," a sharp, perfectly composed voice answered immediately. "You have been off the grid for 4 days, sir." The board was beginning to worry. "Let them worry," Arthur replied coldly. "I have a priority target, a local real estate holding company registered under the name Miller, former law enforcement, currently operating a slumlord racket in Sector 4. I am pulling the regional data now, sir, Elias said, the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoing softly through the receiver. I see him. Miller Properties, LLC. He holds the deeds to 14 residential buildings, financed heavily through regional banks. He is highly leveraged. Not leveraged enough, Arthur commanded, his eyes locked on the door of apartment 4B. Initiate Protocol 4. I want his financial existence erased. Contact our shadow proxies at Vanguard. Buy out every single mortgage debt he owes by the end of the hour. Once we hold the paper, call in his margins. Freeze his operational accounts. Trigger a forensic audit into his shell companies. I want every bribe he's ever paid, every tax he's ever dodged, exposed by midnight. Understood, Mr. Sterling. The acquisition will require an immediate cash transfer of roughly $14 million to secure the debt portfolios at a premium. Transfer 20. Just make it fast, Arthur said, his tone turning to ice. When he wakes up tomorrow, I want his credit cards declined. I want his assets locked. I want him drowning in so much legal fire that he forgets how to breathe. Consider it done, sir. What is your current status? Arthur looked back into the apartment. Sarah was desperately trying to wrap her mother in the thin, frayed woolen blanket, her hands shaking as she tried to pack their meager belongings into a single duffel bag. The old woman looked pale, her energy fading fast. I have 2 guests, Arthur said quietly. Send the medical transport unit to my coordinates, not the corporate chopper, the discreet van, and prep the sanctuary. Arthur hung up the phone, slipping it back into the hidden pocket of his ragged coat. He had promised vengeance, and the gears of a multi-billion-dollar machine were now silently grinding Miller to dust. But first, he had to get Sarah and her mother out of the cold. He had to show them the hidden world he had built. Arthur stepped back into the cramped, foul-smelling room. Sarah was frantically stuffing faded sweaters and worn-out shoes into a single, frayed canvas duffel bag. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her breath hitching with suppressed sobs. On the rusted cot, her mother's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythm, her skin carrying a terrifying ashen pallor. Don't pack everything, Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the panic in the room. Just take what cannot be replaced, photographs, documents, leave the rest. Sarah paused, looking at the dirty vagrant as if he had lost his mind. I have nowhere to go, she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a clean line down her soot-stained cheek. The shelters don't take medical equipment. If we leave this room, she is going to freeze on the sidewalk. You are not going to a shelter, Arthur replied simply. Before he could explain, the heavy, aggressive sound of boots echoed up the stairwell. It hadn't been 2 hours. It had barely been 20 minutes. The door to apartment 4B was violently kicked open, the rusted lock splintering out of the wooden frame. 2 massive men stepped over the threshold. They were local enforcers, bouncers that Miller kept on his payroll specifically for illegal physical evictions. They wore tight black shirts, their arms thick with muscle and cheap tattoos. Change of plans, sweetheart, the first enforcer barked, a cruel smirk plastered across his face. Miller decided he doesn't want to wait. You're out right now. No, please, he said, 2 hours. Sarah screamed, backing away to shield her mother. The larger of the 2 men lunged forward, grabbing Sarah by the shoulder of her uniform. With a brutal yank, he tossed her aside like a rag doll and reached out to grab the edge of the dying woman's cot. He never made contact. Arthur closed the distance with terrifying, unnatural speed. The old man in the ragged coat didn't shout a warning. He simply acted. Dropping his center of gravity, Arthur drove the rigid, solid oak shaft of his cane directly into the enforcer's ribcage. The sound of the impact was a dull, heavy thud that knocked the breath instantly from the giant's lungs. As the man doubled over, gasping for air, Arthur hooked the curved handle of the cane behind the enforcer's ankle and swept his leg with brutal efficiency. The massive thug crashed onto his back, shaking the floorboards. The second enforcer roared in anger and charged, throwing a heavy, looping punch aimed straight for Arthur's head. Arthur's expression remained entirely blank. He fluidly sidestepped the wild strike, letting the attacker's own momentum carry him forward. With lightning-fast precision, Arthur grabbed the man's extended wrist, twisted his torso, and locked the joint over his own shoulder. In one seamless, devastating throw, Arthur launched the 200-pound man entirely out of the doorway. The enforcer flew backward, slamming into the concrete wall of the hallway with a sickening, bone-rattling crash. He crumpled to the floor, groaning in agonizing pain, utterly incapacitated. The first enforcer, still gasping on the floor of the apartment, took one look at the cold, calculating eyes of the bearded vagrant and decided to stay exactly where he was. Sarah stared in absolute shock. She was pressed against the peeling wallpaper, her hands over her mouth. The frail, shivering homeless man she had fed 3 days ago had just dismantled 2 giant enforcers in less than 5 seconds, without breaking a single drop of sweat. Before the silence could settle, a new sound filled the corridor. It wasn't the chaotic thud of thugs, but the synchronized, disciplined march of tactical boots. 3 men wearing immaculately tailored dark suits and discreet earpieces stepped into the hallway. Behind them were 2 paramedics clad in tactical black uniforms, wheeling a state-of-the-art, motorized medical gurney equipped with portable oxygen concentrators and heart monitors. They moved with absolute, military-grade efficiency. The suited men effortlessly stepped over the groaning enforcer in the hallway and secured the perimeter of the apartment. The lead paramedic rushed straight to the cot. Within seconds, a high-grade oxygen mask was placed over Sarah's mother's face, and her vital signs were being monitored on a glowing digital tablet. O2 levels are critical, but we have her stabilized, the paramedic reported with crisp professionalism. Ready for immediate transport. The lead man in the dark suit stepped forward. He did not look at the thugs. He did not look at Sarah. He looked directly at the vagrant in the filthy wool coat and bowed his head slightly. "The perimeter is secure, and the transport van is waiting downstairs, Mr. Sterling," the man said smoothly. "We also have confirmation from Vanguard. Miller's primary bank accounts have just been frozen. His lenders are initiating foreclosure protocols as we speak." Sarah's breath hitched. Her eyes darted from the high-tech medical team to the men in the expensive suits and finally rested on the old man she had given half a turkey sandwich to. "Mr. Sterling." She whispered the name, feeling utterly foreign in her mouth. Arthur turned to her. He reached up and slowly pulled off the grime-covered baseball cap. He unbuttoned the heavy, foul-smelling wool coat, letting it drop to the floor. Underneath, he wore a simple, clean, dark cashmere sweater. His posture shifted, abandoning the hunched shoulders of a beggar, revealing the towering, authoritative presence of a billionaire who commanded an empire. "Your mother is going to be fine, Sarah," Arthur said gently, the gravelly edge of his voice softening for the first time. "We are going to a private medical sanctuary. She will have the best doctors in the country, and it will not cost you a single cent." He walked toward the door, pausing just as the paramedics began to carefully roll the gurney out of the cramped apartment. "3 days ago, you had nothing, yet you gave me half of your food and a blanket to keep me warm," Arthur said, looking deeply into her tear-filled eyes. "You showed kindness in a city that usually punishes it. Now, it is my turn to show you what happens when that kindness is repaid." He gestured toward the door, flanked by his elite security team. "Come, you are never sleeping in a place like this again." The federal holding cell in downtown Manhattan was cold, smelling of stale sweat and cheap industrial cleaner. But Miller was not a man who surrendered to the system. He was a man who had manipulated it for decades. Sitting on the rigid metal bench, his arm still throbbing in its compression bandage, Miller waited until the duty officer, a detective he had personally kept on a $5,000 a month retainer for years, walked past the iron bars. The detective didn't make eye contact, but a sleek, untraceable burner phone slid silently across the floor, stopping at Miller's heavy boots. Miller snatched it up, his face contorted in a mask of desperate, venomous rage. He dialed a scrambled international number. It rang twice. "Graves," Miller whispered urgently, his voice thick with malice. "Everything is gone. Vanguard seized the accounts. But I have one offshore ledger left, and it's yours if you do exactly what I say. The target is Arthur Sterling. He took the retail girl, Sarah, to his private medical compound in the northern hills. I need leverage to force Vanguard to release my assets. Breach the compound, take the girl, bring her to the extraction point." "Consider it done," a cold, metallic voice replied before the line went dead. 60 miles north, dusk was settling over the Sterling sanctuary. The sprawling, ultra-modern facility was bathed in the warm, ambient glow of recessed lighting. Sarah stood near the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass of the private recovery suite, looking out at the manicured Zen gardens. Her mother was resting peacefully in the magnetic levitation bed, her breathing deep and even, completely free of the terrifying rattle that had haunted their cramped apartment. The sliding door hissed open, and Arthur stepped into the room. He had changed from his Brioni suit into functional, dark tactical slacks and a fitted black long-sleeve shirt. He held his weathered oak cane in his left hand, a stark contrast to the high-tech environment. "She is responding perfectly to the synthetic oxygen therapy," Arthur said quietly, walking to stand beside Sarah. "By the end of the week, she will be walking the gardens." Sarah turned to him, the overwhelming gratitude rendering her speechless for a moment. "I don't even know how to begin repaying you for this. A lifetime of my wages wouldn't cover a single day here." Arthur looked at her, his expression softening. "You paid your debt when you chose compassion over self-preservation in that alleyway, Sarah. You owe me no." Suddenly, the warm ambient lighting in the room vanished, instantly replaced by a silent, pulsing crimson glow. The emergency lockdown sequence had been triggered. "Sir," Elia's voice crackled sharply through the hidden intercom in Arthur's earpiece. "We have a Class A perimeter breach at the East Loading Bay. 4 hostiles. Heavy kinetic armor, professional grade. They bypass the outer thermal sensors using thermal blanking cloaks. They are moving aggressively toward the medical wing's central atrium." Arthur's eyes went completely cold. The billionaire philanthropist vanished and the apex predator returned. "Lock down the medical wing. Keep Sarah and the patients sealed behind the titanium bulkheads," Arthur commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. "Do not send the security teams. These are elite contractors. They will tear through standard guards. I will handle this." "Arthur, what is happening?" Sarah panicked, stepping back from the pulsing red lights. "Stay here," Arthur said, turning toward the door. "No one is taking you back to the dark." Arthur stepped out of the suite, the heavy blast doors slamming shut and sealing with a massive pneumatic hiss behind him. He walked purposefully down the pristine white marble corridor toward the central atrium, his grip tightening on the curved handle of his heavy oak cane. In the massive multi-level atrium below, 4 mercenaries clad in matte black tactical gear moved with terrifying synchronization. Graves, the massive team leader, kicked open the stairwell doors, his assault rifle raised. They were professionals, expecting a firefight with security guards. They were not expecting a single, unarmed man standing calmly at the center of the atrium floor. Arthur did not wait for them to aim. He exploded into motion. The sheer velocity of his attack shattered the mercenary's tactical formation. Graves' point man lunged forward to strike Arthur with the heavy stock of his rifle. Arthur flawlessly sidestepped the sweeping blow, his movement a continuous, unbroken flow of kinetic energy. He clamped his hand over the mercenary's wrist, twisting the rifle barrel sharply upward while driving the solid base of his cane directly into the man's sternum. The concussive impact echoed like a gunshot through the atrium, knocking the air entirely from the operative's lungs. Without breaking stride, Arthur hooked the man's leg, launching him over his hip in a devastating judo throw that sent the heavily armored mercenary crashing violently into a decorative marble fountain. The second and third mercenaries dropped their rifles, pulling heavy, serrated combat knives, realizing firearms were useless in such tight, chaotic proximity. They rushed Arthur simultaneously from opposite sides, attempting to trap him in a lethal pincer movement. Arthur's eyes tracked their movements with chilling precision. As the blade came slashing toward his ribs, he parried the strike with the rigid oak shaft of his cane, sweeping the weapon aside. Using his own momentum, Arthur spun behind the attacker, locking the man's arm behind his back and using his heavy, armored body as a human shield against the third mercenary's incoming strike. The third man hesitated for a fraction of a second to avoid hitting his teammate, a fatal mistake. Arthur delivered a blindingly fast, crushing kick to the side of the third man's knee, buckling his leg instantly. He then drove his elbow backward into the captive mercenary's tactical helmet, sending him sprawling unconscious onto the polished marble floor. Only Graves remained. The massive mercenary leader roared, charging at Arthur with the sheer, unstoppable force of a freight train. He tackled Arthur around the waist, lifting him off his feet and slamming him brutally against the reinforced glass wall of the atrium. The impact rattled the entire structure. Graves pinned Arthur, raising a massive, heavy-duty tactical baton to crush his skull. Arthur's face remained an unreadable mask of absolute focus. As the baton descended, the battle reached a terrifying crescendo. The heavy tactical baton descended with lethal velocity, a blur of dark metal aimed directly at Arthur's skull. In the microscopic window of time between life and death, Arthur did not panic. He exhaled sharply, twisting his torso with agonizing speed. The baton missed his temple by a fraction of an inch, slamming into the reinforced glass behind him with a deafening, thunderous crack. A massive spiderweb of white fractures erupted across the transparent barrier, but the glass held. With Graves' momentum heavily overextended from the missed strike, Arthur seized the offensive. He drove his knee viciously into the narrow gap of the mercenary's tactical armor, striking the solar plexus. Graves choked, his grip faltering just enough for Arthur to break free. Arthur didn't create distance, he closed it. Grabbing the heavy Kevlar collar of Graves' vest, Arthur used the massive man's own weight against him. He pivoted sharply, reversing their positions and slammed Graves backward into the already fractured glass. Graves roared, wildly swinging his free arm in a desperate, looping hook. Arthur flawlessly ducked underneath the strike. In a continuous, fluid motion, he brought the heavy oak shaft of his cane up, executing a brutal, upward thrust directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster under Graves' arm. The kinetic shockwave was absolute. Graves' arm instantly went completely dead, the tactical baton clattering uselessly onto the marble floor. But the mercenary leader was a seasoned brawler. He launched a desperate, crushing headbutt toward Arthur's face. Arthur caught the strike with the palm of his free hand, absorbing the impact against the hardened composite of Graves' helmet. With cold, calculated precision, Arthur swept his cane in a low, devastating arc behind Graves' heavy combat boots. He violently shoved the mercenary's chest, completely removing his center of gravity. Graves crashed onto the polished marble with a bone-rattling thud. Before the massive man could attempt to roll, Arthur spun the cane in his hands, driving the heavy, brass-capped base of the oak shaft squarely into the side of Graves' tactical helmet. The sheer concussive force echoed through the atrium. Graves' eyes rolled back, and his massive frame went entirely limp. Silence descended over the compound, broken only by the steady hum of the ventilation system and Arthur's controlled breathing. He stood amidst the unconscious bodies of the 4 elite operatives, calmly straightening the cuffs of his dark shirt. He pressed his earpiece. "Elias," Arthur said steadily, leaning his weight casually onto his cane. "The atrium is clear. Send the containment crew. Strip them of their comms and armor and prep them for federal drop-off." "Understood, Mr. Sterling," Elias replied smoothly. "And regarding our mutual friend in the Manhattan holding cell." "End him," Arthur commanded. 60 miles south, in the damp, claustrophobic federal lockup, Miller paced back and forth like a caged animal. He clutched the burner phone, waiting for the call from Graves confirming the girl had been taken. He could already taste the victory. He would force Vanguard to return his empire, and he would crush Arthur Sterling under his boot. The heavy steel door at the end of the cell block groaned open. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed down the corridor. Miller rushed to the bars, a triumphant sneer forming on his face. "It's about time." His voice died in his throat. It wasn't his corrupt detective. It was a man in an immaculate, dark-tailored suit. The Vanguard agent stood in front of the cell, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He held up a glowing tablet, pressing it flat against the iron bars so Miller could clearly see the high-definition screen. It was a live security feed of the Sterling Sanctuary atrium. Miller watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as a containment crew effortlessly dragged the unconscious, defeated bodies of Graves and his elite strike team across the pristine marble floor. "Your offshore accounts have been legally seized under federal protocols, Mr. Miller, as funding for domestic terrorism," the Vanguard agent stated in a flat, chilling tone. "Your extraction team is neutralized. Your assets no longer exist. You no longer exist." The agent turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the echoing silence of the prison. Miller collapsed to his knees, the burner phone slipping from his trembling fingers. The walls of the cell seemed to close in around him, finally burying him alive in a tomb of his own making. Back at the sanctuary, the heavy blast doors of the medical suite hissed open. Sarah spun around, her heart pounding violently in her chest. Arthur stood in the doorway. There was not a single mark on him. He looked perfectly composed, the terrifying apex predator once again hidden entirely behind the calm, reassuring demeanor of the billionaire philanthropist. "It is over," Arthur said softly, offering her a faint, genuine smile as he looked toward her sleeping mother. "You are safe. Rest now, Sarah. Tomorrow you start your new life." The heavy blast doors of the medical suite sealed shut with a soft, reassuring hiss, leaving Sarah to the quiet safety of her mother's side. Arthur stood in the pristine hallway for a moment, his posture perfectly rigid. The compound was secure, but the adrenaline of the atrium fight still hummed beneath his skin. He needed a drink. Arthur made his way down the dimly lit corridor to his private study. The room was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, lined with ancient, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a roaring fireplace, and a massive mahogany desk. He walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table and poured a measure of aged scotch. As he raised the glass, his eyes locked onto the faint reflection in the window pane. The air pressure in the room shifted by a microscopic fraction. Graves hadn't brought 4 men. He had brought 5. A shadow detached itself from the high architectural beams of the vaulted ceiling. The 5th operative, a silent, heavily armored assassin, dropped completely silently to the Persian rug directly behind Arthur. The assassin didn't carry a firearm. He wielded dual, high-voltage electrified eskrima sticks, crackling with a lethal blue arc of energy. The assassin lunged, swinging the glowing baton in a vicious, decapitating arc. Arthur dropped the Scotch glass. He didn't turn. He simply collapsed his center of gravity, dropping into a deep crouch as the electrified baton hissed mere millimeters over his head, the static charge raising the hairs on his neck. In a single, unbroken motion, Arthur spun on his heel, bringing his heavy oak cane up to intercept the assassin's second downward strike. The rigid oak collided with the electrified baton with a sharp, concussive crack. Arthur didn't try to overpower the much younger, heavily armored operative. Instead, he redirected the kinetic energy, parrying the strike outward and stepping directly into the assassin's guard. The operative snarled behind his dark visor, thrusting his second baton toward Arthur's ribs. Arthur's reaction was terrifyingly precise. He slammed the palm of his free hand against the flat side of the incoming weapon, knocking it off its trajectory. Instantly, he snaked his arm around the assassin's extended wrist, trapping it in a brutal joint lock. With a sharp, devastating pivot of his hips, Arthur used the assassin's own forward momentum to launch him entirely over his shoulder. The armored operative flew across the study, crashing violently onto the center of the massive mahogany desk. The heavy wood groaned and splintered under the immense impact. Before the assassin could recover, Arthur closed the distance with predatory speed. The operative desperately swung his remaining baton from his back, but Arthur stepped inside the arc. He drove the heavy, brass-capped base of his cane directly into the center of the operative's chest plate. The sheer blunt force trauma knocked the breath from the man's lungs. In the same fluid sequence, Arthur swept his cane upward, catching the edge of the operative's tactical helmet, violently snapping his head to the side. The assassin's eyes rolled back, his body going entirely limp as he slid off the shattered desk and collapsed onto the rug. The electrified batons clattered to the floor, sparking once before powering down into silence. The study was quiet again, save for the crackling of the fireplace. The door burst open and Elias rushed in, an elite Vanguard security team heavily armed behind him. The usually unflappable head of security looked genuinely horrified at the sight of the unconscious operative and the ruined study. "Mr. Sterling," Elias started, his voice tight. He bypassed the thermal grid completely. It was an inexcusable oversight on my part. Arthur casually straightened the cuffs of his dark shirt, picking up his cane from the floor. He wasn't breathing heavily. Graves was always thorough. "Clean this up, Elias, and ensure the perimeter is sealed tighter than a submarine." "Immediately, sir," Elias bowed, signaling the team to drag the unconscious assassin away. The next morning broke over the Sterling sanctuary in a wave of brilliant, golden sunlight. Sarah walked out onto the private terrace attached to her suite. The view took her breath away. Hundreds of acres of lush, manicured gardens, tranquil koi ponds, and towering oak trees stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was a paradise, utterly removed from the grime, fear, and hopelessness of the city they had left behind. She heard a soft hum and turned. Her mother was sitting up in a motorized, high-tech wheelchair, guided by a smiling Vanguard nurse onto the terrace. The terrifying, ashen pallor was completely gone from her skin, replaced by a healthy, vibrant warmth. She was breathing easily without a machine, her eyes shining with tears of absolute joy as she looked at her daughter. "Mom," Sarah whispered, running over and dropping to her knees, burying her face in her mother's lap. "I'm here, sweetie." Her mother stroked her hair, her voice steady and strong. "I'm really here." A set of footsteps drew their attention. Arthur walked onto the terrace, leaning lightly on his cane. He wore a simple, tailored gray suit, looking completely at peace. "Good morning," Arthur said warmly. The medical team informs me that your mother's recovery is nothing short of miraculous. She will be here for a few weeks for physical therapy, but she is entirely out of the woods." Sarah stood up, wiping her eyes. "Arthur, I spent all night trying to think of how to thank you, how to repay this. I can work. I can clean the compound, I can." Arthur held up a hand, chuckling softly. "Sarah, you are not cleaning anything." He stepped closer, looking out over the sprawling estate. "Vanguard is not just a financial empire. We have a foundation, a massive one. Its sole purpose is to find people who have fallen through the cracks, people who are crushed by men like Miller, and give them a second chance. But I need people who understand what it means to have nothing. I need people whose compassion cannot be bought or broken." He turned to look her directly in the eyes. "I don't want you to be a charity case, Sarah. I want you to be an executive. I want you to help me run the Vanguard Foundation. Together, we are going to make sure that no one in that city ever has to choose between freezing on the street or bowing to a tyrant ever again." Sarah stared at him, the magnitude of the offer washing over her. She looked back at her mother, who nodded with a proud, tearful smile. "When do I start?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling not with fear but with an overwhelming, unstoppable hope. Arthur smiled, the cold shadows of the past finally dissolving in the morning sun. "Today."